I think whiskey tastings ought to begin with whiskey tasting. So let's get into the first one. So I guess everybody at home has the box in front of them. So if you haven't cracked the first one yet, Hedonism, please do now. We're going to crack a full-size bottle here to get going. I've already poured Scott. I'm going to pour you, Richard, and
thank you.
For myself. And we are going to get going. All right. So there's no one best way to taste whiskey. You do it any way that you are comfortable doing it. And what I like to do is I like to swirl it around the glass, because what that does is it starts to throw more aroma molecules off the liquid. And when you stick your nose in there, you get more aroma and more of a sense of what this whiskey is going to taste like. Now we're going to taste it at bottling strength. So in the case of Hedonism, that's 43%. You're welcome to add water to it at home. You're welcome to do it any way you want. At Compass Box, we are quite clear about the fact that you can drink whiskey any way you want. There's no right way, there's no wrong way. So we're going to swirl it. We're going to sniff. Add your water if you like. I'm going to raise my glass and say, cheers.
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 Paul? So I do this for a living. So I'm used to tasting whiskey and spitting whiskey into a bucket or a sink in our blending room or whatever it might be, because that's what we have to do in order to continue to focus throughout the day and do our jobs. But I hope that you folks are all at home and able to enjoy it.
Yeah, I can confidently say we all do this as a hobby, and people won't be using a spittoon.
That's fine. Well, so in your mouth right now, I'm going to lead the witnesses here a little bit and suggest that you are probably tasting in your mouth something that reminds you of vanilla. Vanilla. And I'll put a little more color to that. To me, it reminds me of pastry cream. If you're into baking, or if anyone in your life is into baking, or vanilla cream. Maybe there's little hints of notes of like spice, like cinnamon or something like that. But all these things I'm describing that I'm getting, and I hope most of you are getting, or if not all of you, are aromas, flavors that are really appealing. Vanilla and caramel. I'm getting a little bit too. Spices like cinnamon, cream. All those things are really appealing flavor notes. And that's why this whiskey called Hedonism is it's popular amongst the people we work with and people we do whiskey tastings with, like yourself, because it's hard not to like a whiskey like this. What is this thing? It's a grain whiskey. It's Scotch grain whiskey, and that's unusual. There are not many 100% Scotch grain whiskeys sold in Scotland. Let me back up a little bit and tell you a little bit more about the sort of basics of Scotch whiskey, a real sort of quick primer, and then we'll move on to questions. If you have them, ask away. We'll move on to another whiskey, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about Compass Box and how this guy with an American accent got in the Scotch whiskey industry. So in Scotland, as many of you, some of you may know, many of you perhaps, there are two kinds of whiskey we distill: malt whiskey and grain whiskey. Malt whiskey is the famous one, right? So people think of single malts, which are malt whiskeys from one single distillery. And today there are over 120 malt whiskey distilleries working away in Scotland. However, there are less than a dozen grain whiskey distilleries, and they make far more liquid, far more spirit in the course of a given year than malt whiskey distilleries. And so why is this? That's because when you blend malt whiskeys and grain whiskeys, you've got what's called blended Scotch whiskey. And that's the biggest selling category of Scotch whiskey. And there's 5 categories of Scotch whiskey. Okay, bear with me for a second. There's blended Scotch whiskey. So all those are the big names that you've heard of, like, the Johnny Walkers and the famous Grouses and the Chivas Regals and all of those. And we make a blended Scotch whiskey, several blended Scotch whiskeys. But we also make malt whiskeys. 100% malt whiskeys. And if you're blending malt whiskeys from different single malt distilleries, that's called a blended malt. If you're bottling just a malt whiskey from a single distillery, that's a single malt whiskey. So we got 3 out of 5 categories. We got blended Scotch, when you combine grain whiskies and malt whiskies. We've got blended malt whiskey, when you're combining different single malts. We've got single malt whiskey, just from one single distillery. And then the same thing for grain whiskies. If you are bottling just something from one single grain whiskey distillery, that's called a single grain whiskey. If, as we do with Hedonism, you're bottling grain whiskeys from different distilleries, blending them together to create a different flavor profile than any individual distillery has, that's called a blended grain whiskey. And those are the 5 categories enshrined in law in Scotch whiskey. Blended Scotch, single malt, blended malt, single grain, blended grain. And now with that information, everybody on this call in this tasting knows more about Scotch whiskey than 98.99% of the rest of the population. So congratulations, you're Scotch whiskey aficionado. Right, so we bottled this thing called Hedonism. It was the first whiskey I bottled when I started this business. It'll be 24 years next month, believe it or not. Why did I do it this way? Because I wanted to show the world what Scotch whiskey can be. I started my life wanting to be a winemaker, and then I went back to school, thought I'll be getting business out of wine, and then I didn't get any job offers in the world of wine. I got this job offer from this brand that some of you may have heard of called Johnnie Walker. They hired me to do marketing in the US, in New York, many years ago. And I took the job because the company at the time also sold wine. I thought, oh, I'll do this Scotch whiskey thing for a while, and then I'll move to wine, and my dreams will have come true. And then they sent me to Scotland very early on in my first year, and I fell in love. Fell in love on the Isle of Skye, Talisker Distillery. I fell in love on this trip visiting. We visited around 10 different single malt distilleries over the course of a full week. I ended up in the blending room for this brand I was working for, and met one of the legends in blending in Scotch whiskey industry, Maureen Robinson, just retired recently from Diageo. One of the great blenders of certainly the last of my generation. And that's when I really fell in love with this creative idea that blending to me represented. I'll tell you what I think blending is. I know so many people in the world think single malts are the best. And that's okay if they think that. What we've been talking about for 23 years, it's not about whether it's a single malt whiskey from a single distillery, or it's a single grain whiskey from a single distillery, or it's a blend with malt whiskeys and grain whiskeys, or it's a blend with just single malt. It's not about the category. It's about the quality of the liquid in the bottle. And that comes down to the reputation of the people putting it in the bottle. And that's why I talk to people about, you shouldn't be buying categories. Oh, it has to be single malt. You should be buying the reputation of the producers. That's kind of how people tend to think in the world of wine. And that's the way more and more people, I think, have been thinking about Scotch whiskey over the years. When I started the company, so they eventually moved me over here to the UK with that big brand I was working for. And after a while, and this is going back now about 25 years or more, I realized Scotch whiskey at the time, the industry was really in the doldrums. Global shipments were flat or declining depending on the year. The biggest markets for Scotch whiskey were in free fall in terms of sales, like the United States and in this country. And I thought, when I discovered what Scotch whiskey could be, I thought it's just a problem in presenting it to people. It's just a problem in making it relevant to more people. And so I went to my big company. I said, let me start over. Let me create a new brand. I'll get outside the HQ, take a few folks with me, and we'll do something fresh. Taking a lot of inspiration from the world of wine, lots of entrepreneurs in the world of wine. And they said, oh, that's a nice idea, but it's not big enough an opportunity for us. They said no. And so some months went by, and I turned to my wife, Aim, at one point on a holiday, because when you're on holiday, of course, you think much more freely. And I said, Aim, I could do this myself. And this was before we had children, of course, before Josh and Zach came along. So it was a slightly easier decision for her to say, John, okay, if that's what you have to do, that's what you have to do. And I started Compass Box. October 23rd, 2000, we launched our first whiskey. I launched it because it was just me. It was called Hedonism. And it was a grain whiskey because I wanted to show people a side of Scotch whiskey that not many people, even the enthusiasts, were aware of. Grain whiskey, when it's aged in good quality American oak casks, they give it that lovely vanilla character that you were tasting earlier. They make a good quality Scotch grain whiskey, I think, like this, if you ask me. They're one of the most delicious styles of whiskey in the world, I think. Most approachable styles of whiskey in the world, I think.
Thank you. Well, I can say 100% that we have some converts in the room, from the idea that only single malts are good whiskies, and that they have to have age statements on them as well, 12, 15 years plus. We've got converts in the room who I know have tried Hedonism before when they've come around to my house, and their reaction is, wow, and what is this? And I don't believe you when I say it's a blended grain. So kudos, and I'm excited that everyone here is able to enjoy their own hedonism, frankly, and not drink wine. But I know that we've got a couple of questions coming in already very quickly. One of which is, we appear, you and I, to be drinking from what looks like a wine glass. Is there any reason behind that?
Yeah.
And then the other question from someone else is, when you pour whiskey, do you try to get air into it like you would a wine? Does it change how it noses or how it tastes? Is there a particular pouring approach that you suggest?
I love drinking whiskey out of wine glasses. Scott, would you grab one of those glasses off the rack behind you that are hanging upside down, please? When we're working in the blending room, nosing whiskeys, whether they're single casks, like all these sample bottles behind me, thank you, or whether they're prototype blends that we're creating, we use these little, what we call nosing glasses. And they're called nosing glasses because they're really good at allowing you to nose or smell the whiskey in there. What they're not so good for is drinking the whiskey, because as you probably know that when we are drinking something or eating something, most of our sense of taste comes through our nose, outside of the basics. So when you're trying to drink out of these, you see my nose, I don't know if you can see it, it doesn't quite get in there. So they're great for nosing, but they're not great for drinking. And that's why I choose to use wine glasses, because they have a tulip shape like the nosing glass. So that helps focus the aromas as they're thrown off the liquid. So you get a good concentrated aroma, but they're much better for drinking. See, my nose fits in it. So that's why I love wine glasses. And we've got some big Cabernet Bordeaux glasses over there, stemmed glasses, these lovely glasses I love. And when we do meals in here or special tastings, we'll put the big stemmed glasses out, and you get a really healthy measure into those, and it really swirl it around, and the aromas focus, and it's just a beautiful experience. I like drinking whiskey out of wine glasses. That's okay. That's okay. Rocks glasses are great. Time and a place for everything, guys. But they are straight-sided, and so they don't focus the aromas as much as wine glasses, tulip shapes.
Of course, our message is drink responsibly, but when you pour Scotch whiskey into a wine glass such as this, obviously you need to pour a finger, and you end up with a little bit more than a double. So
actually,
we're not going to complain.
Our message, Richard, is drink good stuff.
Drink good stuff.
First and foremost. Then drink responsibly. And then the aeration.
And the aeration?
Yeah, so I swirl it around, and that's aerating the whiskey. And it's throwing off, as I said earlier, more aroma molecules and allowing you to get more out of it. I do, when I taste whiskey in the office, and some people do this in the industry and some don't, I do aerate it, so kind of slurp it the way wine tasters do. Some people do that, some people don't, excuse me. I find that aeration does help me get a bigger picture, if you will, a bigger sense of the flavors in the whiskey, and that's why I do that. I'm a big advocate of adding water or even ice, especially when it's 30 degrees, folks, okay? So congratulations for joining whiskey tasting on a day when it's like 32. I hope you're all in air-conditioned comfort. If not, you need to chill your whiskeys down, because drinking whiskey at 30 degrees is not a comfortable experience, because alcohol is more readily coming off. So it's okay to add water. It's okay to add ice if you want. And what happens when you do that sometimes, usually, almost all the time, every time actually, you're diluting the whiskey, yes, and then you're starting to see different sides of the whiskey, different aspects, I should say, of the aromas and flavors. Some aroma compounds are more water soluble than others. Some come out more when the whiskey is diluted. So it's a great way to really understand the whiskey in a different ways by adding water or even ice on a night like tonight.
So I know a couple of people are raising their hands to ask questions, and because I'm a novice at this, I'm not quite sure how to respond to them, but there's a little icon. Perfect. So there's a little icon in the bottom right hand of your screen that looks a little bit like a call out bubble, except it's rectangular. If you write your questions in there, then we'll be able to respond to them. And someone's already saying that they can see merchandise glassware coming down the Spirited Club's pipeline in due course. You're absolutely right. We will have that, because it's not just about the liquid itself, although that is 99% of it. It's also about what you're drinking from and who you're drinking with. So we can't provide the friends, but we can certainly provide the fantastic scotch and also the fantastic glasses. But please write your questions into the in-call messages. It's on the bottom right. It looks like a call-out bubble, and we'll be reviewing those and responding to those during the call, as I think we're moving on to the second
Okay,
whiskey.
let's get into malt whiskeys now. It's malt whiskeys for the rest of the show.